Hello, and welcome once again to EWTN News' ongoing coverage of the Pan-Amazonian Synod from here in Rome. I'm Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor for EWTN News. Thank you so much for joining me once again for these daily updates from the Synod. Well, one of the major topics of conversation, discussion, and of importance to the Church as well as to this very Synod is that of evangelization. But one of those other words that has entered into the important discussions is enculturation. How do we enculturate the faith? How do we evangelize properly? And how do we do all of that without abandoning our fidelity to the teachings of the Church? Well, this Synod itself has raised a number of let's just say controversial issues that also pertain to evangelization and enculturation. How important are all of these things, and what role are they going to play in the final document that the Synod will release? To discuss all of this, I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Condon, who is the DC editor for the Catholic News Agency, who's here in Rome helping to cover the Synod. Ed, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we've been hearing a lot about evangelization, about enculturation, but we've also been hearing a lot about viri probati and potentially deaconesses. How does all of this sort of fit together as a topic for a Pan-Amazonian Synod?
I don't know that it does actually fit together as one topic. I think really what we're seeing here is a Synod that has at least 4 different topics and strains of dialogue going on. There's very much a strong ecological strain, talking about the dangers to the Amazon as a rainforest, as a natural habitat.
A lot of discussion about Laudato Si, for example, the Pope's 2015 encyclical.
Indeed. In the daily press briefing yesterday, I think it was invoked something like 16 times. I mean, it's, and rightly so. This is a question of serious ecological consequences and climate change and things like that. It's right that be talked about. At the same time, that is linked to the plight of indigenous peoples in different parts of the Amazon, whether they're being displaced by development or seeing their habitats put under pressure. But then you also have a sort of wider question about how do you reach out to them pastorally, which leads to viri probati, questions of married men, possibly the role of women in the ministerial life of the Church in the Amazon. So I think there are some thin threads running through it, but really it's not unfair to say that we're dealing with a number of parallel synodal discussions here.
We've had this discussion about enculturation and evangelization, and one of those underlying fears for a lot of people, I know because we get a lot of comments to this daily update concerning the viri probati, concerning are we going to somehow abandon who we are as a church in order to try to enculturate? So let's start, though, with the question that I posed just the other day to Cardinal Kurt Koch, who is the, I think, president of the Pontifical Council for Ecumenism, basically Christian unity.
Yes.
I asked him the simple question of how important is evangelization and enculturation to the work of the Synod, and here was his response.
Evangelization needs always enculturation, because the gospel will be understood in different cultures. But I think we must see 2 things. So first of all, this enculturation. On the other side is purification of the culture, because not all things in other culture are good. We have different challenges and different problems, and we must to have a clear discernment of spirit, what we can accept, what we can receive from this culture for a better understanding of the gospel, and on the other hand, we must purify something in this culture.
That was Cardinal Kurt Koch, who is the president of the Pontifical Council for Promotion of Christian Unity. And Ed, he used a key word, and that was one of the words that I wanted to talk to you about today, and that is purification. That's something we have not been hearing a lot of in this Synod, especially as it relates to enculturation and evangelization.
That's right. I mean, purification is something that is intrinsically linked to the gospel. It's a purifying message. It comes to purify our own faith, our own lives, and certainly it comes to purify whatever culture it comes into contact with. And I think we're seeing really in this Synod something of a generational divide in how people think of evangelization. There is a deep strain of thought that you can see in some, I would say, predominantly European participants in this Pan-Amazonian Synod, who really view the idea that the gospel can have a transformative effect on a culture almost with some hesitation or even skepticism.
Almost embarrassment.
Yes.
I mean, there seems to be a pride that they have taken, that they've baptized almost no one.
Well, and that, I mean, that's an even more questionable issue,
Right.
because obviously baptism is the church's first mandate. It is the great mandate of Christ to go out and to baptize. So I think, but also we're seeing increasingly people who have arrived either as auditors or experts are speaking up and saying that no, there is an indigenous voice that is authentically Christian here, and they don't see the gospel as in tension with their own culture. At the daily press briefing today, there was a professor from an indigenous university who was asked, along with the rest of the panel, about the place for a possible Amazonian rite, and he sort of cut across a lot of people talking about this idea and said, look, the most important thing is that we're all Christians. We all believe in one God. We all believe in Jesus Christ, and it's nice to hear that.
But we're also hearing from some of the Synod participants that Christianity, Western Christianity, has been imposed on them, that it's almost an enemy to the indigenous peoples. And that type of thinking is driving comments, certainly, on this program, pretty wild. But it raises, I think, some deeper theological concerns, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it's important to say that there is a history in parts of the world of Western imposition, and this often came with a Christian flavor. But Christianity is not a Western religion. As a point of history, it's an Eastern religion.
Yes, exactly.
And it's not correct to speak of Christianity as a fundamentally imperialist notion. That, when the Catechism speaks of evangelization, when the Catechism speaks of spreading the gospel, it says enculturation is a must. It's an essential part. It's not something we can avoid or take or leave. It's not something that's been added on. This is part of how the Church speaks about the spread of the gospel, that it finds a root everywhere and it's always fresh.
And one of the phrases that we've heard even before the start of the Synod and in the ramp up to it was, we have to have a church with an Amazonian face. And that is sometimes used then to argue, well, we need to really embrace indigenous culture in a way that might be unrecognizable to a liturgist, for example.
That's right. And we've heard a lot of talk about these things even in the months leading up to this Synod. I think it was back in March or February in one of the pre-synodal meetings, it was suggested by a Brazilian theologian that we could replace the Eucharistic bread with yucca.
Right. And which is just, not to mention theologically wrong, sacramentally wrong, but it's a horrifying and heretical notion.
Well, it's just impossible. It's
right.
not, it would not be a valid sacrament.
Right.
It's impossible to effect transubstantiation of the Eucharist with anything other than wheat bread. And I think that shows that there's perhaps more enthusiasm than clarity of thought in some of these conversations. But really in the end, and this is something that a lot has been said about over and over again, particularly during the daily press briefings with different members and auditors and voting fathers of the Synod, they all say, in the end, all of this is on the shoulders and in the heart, one of them said today, of the Holy Father. Because that's what a Synod is. This is all for his benefit, really. All a Synod is, canonically speaking, is a talking shop. It's a place for the Pope to hear ideas, and then he will go whatever way he wants.
But the spin outside the Synod Hall is that almost anything that survives the vote of the Modi, or these propositions, will somehow almost automatically become active and real for the Church.
I think there are a lot of people who like to think of it that way, but it's worth pointing out that the first person to constantly and consistently say a synodal church is not a parliament, it's not a democracy, is Pope Francis. He said this about the Synod on the Amazon, he said it about the Synod on the Family a few years ago, he said it up with the Synod on young people last year, and he said it about the so-called synodal process being undertaken in Germany. This is not a pope who's going to be bullied, I don't think. He's going to make his own decisions. Now, to what extent they're informed by what's in that final document, we don't know. A lot of the synodal fathers have spoken very strongly for the ordination of married men, for example, but others have spoken very strongly against it. But what they both agreed on is whatever the Synod comes up with in the final document, it's there to provoke, it's there to inspire thought, and it's definitely going to divide people. But really, in the end, that's why we have a pope, is he's the one that has to bring it all together at the end.
Which is a reminder why it pays to pay very close attention to what Pope Francis actually says.
Yes. I think we can get a lot of conversations started and a lot of arguments even started, and a lot of misunderstandings by trying to interpret what the Pope might think about any given thing. And this is the wonderful thing about having a church that's governed as a hierarchy and has a Pope and has a definitive and magisterial teaching authority, is you know what the Church says and you know what the Pope thinks and you know what the Pope teaches, because in the end there's a document with a particular weight attached to it and a particular name at the bottom of it.
Last point for today. Father Raymond de Souza made an observation, and he's not the only one who's made it, that there seem to be two competing documents at this point. There's the Aparecida document, which then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio helped draft was a principal figure that called for a kind of renewed evangelization across the whole of Latin America. And then there's the Instrumentum Laboris. Now, let's accept for the fact that even Pope Francis has said that this is a martyr document that must be destroyed in order for the Synod to function. But Father Raymond's point is that one of those two has to die because they seem to be so diametrically opposed to each other. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's true. I think there are a lot of strains of thought in this synod that simply can't live together. And that's part of what Pope Francis has said he wants to see in other synods, is he wants to see contrary ideas, he wants to see argument, he wants to see, as he says, people making a mess.
Yes.
But someone has to clean it up at the end, and that's the key point. That, it's absolutely true. You can't have a method of evangelization that is, for example, lay-centered and lay-focused and leans heavily on the universal mandate of all Christians to go out and baptize and to, have a full share in that sense of the missionary priesthood of the Church, and one that is so heavily clerical that it says, well, we need to ordain anyone as long as that, will fill a perceived numbers gap. These are two completely contrary conceptions of both the Church and missionary work and evangelization, and also enculturation, I'd argue. So, there are conflicting voices here, but it's not a bad thing that we can't square that circle. I don't think the purpose of a synod is to find a way of making everything come together at the end and making everything reconcile. Sometimes a synod can be about giving a bad idea a good hearing.
And apparently some very bad ideas are getting a hearing.
Well, you'd expect nothing less.
Right. Look forward to your reporting on this, your analysis, as well as your ongoing work relating to the Vatican's seemingly endless financial problems.
Yes.
Ed Condon, editor from D.C., covering the Synod here. Thanks so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for tuning in once again for our daily updates here from EWTN News from the Pan-Amazonian Synod. I'm Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor for EWTN News. Really appreciate your watching these every day. Remember, you can find us all over EWTN social media, especially our platforms on YouTube and Facebook. And we love your comments. Please keep them coming. And we would also be very grateful for your prayers for all of us. And let's remember as well to keep the Synod Fathers and the Holy Father in your prayers. Until tomorrow, please take care and God bless.